Hello and welcome to another episode of the Clicks to Customers podcast. This is your host, John Horn, also CEO of StubGroup. And today we are joined by Marcel Petitpas, who is the co-founder and CEO of Parakeeto. Marcel, thanks so much for joining.
John, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to jump in and talk about kind of all things agencies today. And I think we're going to cover some ground that's both useful to agencies themselves who are listening to this, as well as to businesses who work with and hire agencies. But before we dig into lots of weeds and whatnot, I'd love to hear just kind of what got you into Parakeeto, what made you found it to begin with or co-found it, and what do you focus on doing?
Yeah, so in short, Parakeeto helps agencies measure and improve their profitability. So we solve this problem. We call it a profit management problem in firms. And profit management is a term we developed to describe this weird job that every small agency has that sometimes nobody knows that they're doing it, or if they are doing it, they're doing it off the side of their desk, which is sort of sitting in between finance, operations and delivery, and sales, and trying to bring the data and the context from those three areas of the business together to answer the questions that you need to answer every day when you run an agency, like, are we making any money on our clients and projects? Is our team busy enough? What's the forecast look like? What happens if we do or don't get this client, if we do or don't hire this person? And it's really elusive, because figuring out how to bring all that data together in a way that makes sense is tough. And then it's difficult because often that data is spread out. The processes are different in these different areas of the business, and it can be a really challenging thing. So that's what we exist to solve for. And I started this business because I experienced that when I ran a small agency. And when I got a phone call one day from some friends of mine that I respected, who said, hey, I spend a day a week in spreadsheets trying to solve these problems in my business. There has to be a better way to do this. It immediately resonated. And so, that's sort of where the problem started. And we started calling our friends that ran agencies, asking them about this, and eventually said, hey, we got to start a company here. There's a problem that needs to be solved. So that was almost 7 years ago now. And we're still kicking and still making improvements to the way that we do that today.
Fantastic. I love that. And as someone who's running an agency myself, I'm sure we'll cover a lot of very relevant ground today.
Oh,
So maybe to kick things off, you mentioned you kind of come in between sales, finance, operations. What are some of the biggest disconnects that you generally see between those different sides of a business that you come in and try and help fix?
Yeah, it's a great question. We'll start on the finance side, because this is where most firms today are getting the vast majority of the feedback on how their agency is performing. They get a P&L from their accountant maybe once a month, hopefully once a month. Usually a few weeks after the month is over, it's looking backwards. And a lot of times the level of insight they get from that profit and loss statement is, here's how much money came in the top of the business. Here's a whole bunch of expenses in the middle, and here's how much money came out at the bottom. And unfortunately, for a lot of folks, the amount of money coming out of the bottom is often not what they'd like. And when they feel like they're getting busy enough and they have enough revenue coming in that the profit is starting to look like what they like, they tend to experience a whole bunch of other symptoms in the business, like the team is too busy, they're overworked, they're like, holy shit, you need to hire more people, right? And so they're like, wait a second, why is it that every time it starts to feel like things are going the way they should on the P&L, things start to feel like they're breaking inside of the business? So that is problematic, because with that lens on the business, that you're not making as much profit as you should be, but the important question is why? And when all of your expenses are just sort of lumped into one big category called OpEx, and all your payroll's in there and all your software's in there, it's not clear if the answer is, well, are we not charging enough? Are we over-servicing our clients and spending too much time to get things done? Is our team not busy enough? Are we spending too much on overhead? Is it all of those things? If it is all of those things, to what degree is it each of them? And which one should we be focused on first, right? Those are the things that you need to figure out to take action. But your P&L is not going to give you those, especially when it's structured, in a traditional way. And so a lot of teams end up feeling sort of blind to what they actually need to do next when they rely on the finance department. And the finance department, frankly, it's not generally within the scope of their job nor the scope of their expertise to start going and digging into the sales department, the ops department, to get that information and try to report on the more nuanced aspects of what's going on in the business. That's not really their job. So that's sort of one of the big disconnects in finance, is they're sort of isolated from the context of the actual business, and they're just sort of, reconciling what's happened at a high level at the end of each month, and that's the primary driver for insight in the business. So I'll pause there. I'm curious if that resonates with maybe your experience or what you've heard from other agency owners.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So, I mean, it's like you're saying, it's so important to dig into the nuance of each category and figure out, okay, well, how much are we spending on this, and this, and then when you figure those things out, then you can actually make changes. And that's when you realize, oh wait, we're not making any money by doing this thing over here. Like, this is, you don't see that in the grand scheme of things, but it doesn't stand out, I should say. You certainly see it in the P&L. But then it's like, okay, yeah, we need to right-size this ship. So I assume part of what you do when you dig into these things is really, look at things at a more granular level, break things out by type of expense and category, and then go from there.
Yes, that is part of what we're doing when we work with clients. The first thing we do is an assessment, and that's part of it. We pull their financial information out of their systems and we restructure them in a best practice way. But we'll come back to that because, if it was that easy, then every finance department would be doing it. But unfortunately, there's a lot of nuance to that. And so I'll talk about sales, I'll talk about ops, and I'll talk about the interplay between the three of them, which is also problematic in its own right. So moving on from finance, right, we have this issue, which is we don't really have enough insight into like where the problem is and why the problem is. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that we'll come back to. Then we go up to sales, and in sales, there's all kinds of issues, but the most common one that's absolutely shocking to me is they're responsible for bringing in new business, and they tend to be good at that. They go out, they find new clients, they sell those clients things. And then the conversation I have with a lot of firms is, okay, well, tell me about how you arrive at a price for a client. And I'll usually get a bunch of answers. And when I ask them, okay, well, how do you know if that's a good price or not? Almost nobody is saying, oh, because our margin is X, or we expect to make this much profit selling at this price, because here's what our cost structure for the business looks like that's based on. All of their answers tend to be focused on, this rate card that they came up with in a completely arbitrary way, how these compare to the market, how this compares to the value to the client, which are all important signals, but almost nobody is actually paying attention to how profitable they expect projects to be when they sell them, which is, it might be surprising, but it's very common. And it kind of makes sense because then when you ask them, well, how would you determine the profitability of a project when you're scoping it out? Then you get into all of this nuance of, well, what exactly is the profitability of a project? What does it include and what does it not include? What is the cost of an hour of labor? Is that based on gross capacity, adjusted capacity? What about time off? What about holidays? What about overhead, right? Do those things get factored in or not? And then how much profit is enough profit? And it actually gets really complicated really quickly. And then you mix in the complexity of, well, this thing over here is hourly, this thing over here is a retainer, this thing over here is a productized service, this thing over here is a % of ad spend, and this thing over here is all internal labor, this stuff is all contractors, this thing in the middle is a combination of those things. And so a lot of sales teams are not equipped with a simple framework for pricing that allows them to get clarity on the most important metrics anytime they sell something, which is essentially what is the margin we expect to make and the average billable rate we expect to make, regardless of what the pricing model is, who's doing the work, whether it's internal or external, whether there's pass-through expenses or markup being applied, right? We want a simple framework that can make it clear what's going on every time they sell something, and that's normalized across all the different things that they sell, independent of all that additional complexity. But that can be very overwhelming to them. And at the end of the day, their job and the thing that they're held accountable to is go out and generate revenue. And they're not often being forced to think about, is this revenue actually profitable? Is this revenue actually high quality, right? And this is the issue with a lot of firms is they try to eat their way, out of an indigestion problem, right? They think profitability is a starvation problem. It's actually indigestion, but they try to eat their way out of it. And in a lot of cases, that can actually make things worse. So that's sort of the main dysfunction in the sales department.
That makes a lot of sense. And when you have these conversations, do that deep dive and pull things out, how often would you say does the agency then make significant changes to how they've been pricing their services?
The good news is, and this is actually a little bit surprising, as arbitrary as the way a lot of people arrive at their pricing is, it's not actually that often that we come into a firm and we go like, theoretically, your pricing is like fundamentally problematic. And that it's like, there's no way you could ever be profitable selling things at the rate that you sell them at. It does happen sometimes. And in a lot of cases, there is an opportunity for them to charge more or to change their pricing model in order to increase their margins. Yeah. Although what I will say is it is also very common that based on the scope that they're assuming when they sell things, it would be profitable, but we end up with massive over-servicing problems downstream. And in some cases, that's because their scopes are unrealistic. In other cases, it's because there's actually just operational issues downstream that are creating unnecessary bloat in the amount of time that it takes. So in practice, their effective profitability tends to be a lot lower than what it should theoretically be based on the assumptions being made in sales. But the good news is, and this is maybe counterintuitive because so much of the messaging in the agency space from thought leaders is, position yourself as an expert and increase your prices. That's sort of the first thing that any thought leader will tell you. And it's not bad advice necessarily, but it creates this perception that like everybody's biggest problem is pricing and everybody's profitability problem is pricing. But, interestingly, that has not actually been the case empirically in the data that we've seen from looking at hundreds of firms.
So you've got finance, you've got sales, the third leg to this stool, so to speak, operations. What do you see being some of the biggest problems on the operations side? Yeah,
so operations, of all these areas is probably one of the more complex ones. And it's very important because, sales is the tip of the spear in that they're setting the frame for a lot of the things that happen downstream, right? So if we agree that most agencies are suffering from indigestion, not starvation, well, what you eat is very important in terms of how it's contributing to indigestion. But the second part of that is like how it moves through the system. And operations and delivery is responsible for taking things through the system and getting work delivered, and doing that in a way that is efficient, in a way that is profitable, and being able to like take the expectations from sales and map those through to capacity and then make sure that things happen correctly. And they're also now responsible for kind of being downstream from sales and being upstream from finance. And from a data perspective, a reporting perspective, that can be a really challenging place to be. So what they're often faced with is, they are largely responsible for setting the expectations and doing all the things that lead to a healthy P&L. And ideally, they should be instrumented to measure all the things that lead to a healthy P&L. And when your operations reporting is strong, you should never be surprised by your profit and loss statement. You should know what it's going to look like before you get there. But the challenge is then again, you get into all of these really nuanced conversations like, let's say there's a couple of important metrics for the ops team. It's some kind of revenue earning efficiency metric. That could be a project margin. It could be an average billable rate. It could be an effective hourly rate, like whatever you want to use to say, are we getting things done? Are we earning revenue with a decent amount of time and cost? Okay, so that'd be one idea. The second is utilization. Is our team busy enough, too busy, not busy enough, whatever? Yeah. And, the last one would sort of be like a costing kind of frame. So what is our labor cost? Is it too high? Is it too low? Or are we using too expensive of people, on projects, whatever the case might be. So, those being the three main levers that operations has, but then you get into all the questions of, like, let's take utilization rate, for example. What exactly is utilization? Well, theoretically it's simple. You have how many hours got worked for productive things, right? How do you define that exactly? Well, does internal time count? Is it just billable time? Is it all the time that was worked on the client project, even if it wasn't all billed? So there's nuance there. And then capacity. Well, what exactly is someone's capacity? Is it all of their time? What about holidays? What about time off? What about internal time? What about non-billable time? What about, the company foosball tournament every third Friday that we have, right? So, and there's a lot of arguments over what that should be, and there isn't necessarily alignment. And then the same thing is true about how you measure the profitability or efficiency of a project and how you forecast capacity. And so it can become very complicated, very nuanced. So that's the challenge in operations. And often the people being asked to figure all that stuff out, it's not their full-time job. They're senior project managers, they're operations managers, delivery managers that are still very much in the day-to-day work, and they're trying to solve for this stuff off the side of their desk, often on software platforms that are helping them collect this data, but aren't necessarily coming with a strongly opinionated framework that also happens to align to what's happening upstream in sales and what's happening downstream in finance. So therein lies kind of the other real crux of this is each of these departments could figure out a system that works well for them. But then the nuance is, how do you connect the dots between the three of them and do that in a way that is completely mathematically consistent? So the way you define utilization and the way you define an effective hourly rate on a project is perfectly consistent with how you think about margins on the P&L and how you think about pricing projects and sales. That is the piece that is most elusive. And we see it all the time where you have a firm that's like, man, we spent so much time and money trying to get finance and ops and sales dialed in. It feels like we have all the pieces to the puzzle, but like it still just doesn't make sense. And that's the missing link, is we've never really brought that framework together in a way that's cohesive. So that's sort of the challenge in each department, and then sort of the macro challenge, which is like, even if you figure each of those pieces out, how do you bring it together in a way that makes sense?
Right. Yeah. That that sounds like a fun challenge, a fun puzzle to solve. So
it's been a long 7 years figuring this out.
I can imagine. Yeah, like when you come into an agency and you start having these conversations, I'm sure it varies based upon the agency, but how long on average does it take for those conversations, the ideas you're bringing to bear, to really start having a measurable impact on the firm's profitability?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so I'll kind of separate the impact into sort of two camps. One is a qualitative impact and another is a quantitative impact. And the qualitative impact, I mean, we are sometimes getting a massive qualitative impact in a matter of a couple of weeks, because the first thing that we do is an assessment. And so that allows us to go back and take, the last 12 months of data and process it through our framework and present clients and their entire leadership team their business, looking at it through our lens, supported by a bunch of educational resources. So it's like, for the first time for a lot of these firms, everyone on the team is looking at the same business with the same numbers, with the same lens, and a third party kind of guiding them through that. And they're all finally on the same page about like, here's exactly what's going on, exactly why it's going on, exactly what the problem is, exactly what we need to be focused on, exactly what we need to do next. And they all have a common language now that they can speak to, and math that they can trust, and numbers that they can trust. And they all understand, like, when we talk about this metric, we all understand what it means, why it goes up, why it goes down, what it tells us about our business. So from an alignment perspective, and from just like a confidence perspective and a team dynamics perspective, and how people feel about running the business and making decisions, that can be a dramatic impact that is delivered in just a matter of a few weeks. Now, the second part, which is the quantitative impact, that's a little bit more idiosyncratic, because it depends on what the problem is, but it also depends on the nature of the firm. So, for example, one of the fastest problems to solve is a utilization problem. So if we come in and we figure out like, oh, the reason you're not as profitable as you'd like to be is because your team should be at a 60% utilization rate, but you've been hovering at around 48%. Well, that's simple to fix. It's not easy to fix, but it's simple in that, well, that means you have 12% of extra people on the team, basically. So you could solve that in a few weeks by letting people go. Is that easy? No. Is that necessarily the best decision? Not always, right? But it could be very quick, and you could see a massive improvement in profitability very quickly from that firm. The same thing is generally true for overhead expenses, depending on the nature of what they are. Like if you have a bunch of monthly software subscriptions or services that, if you look at the contracts, could be cut, you could be talking about a couple of months, see a massive return to the bottom line. But overhead challenges are not actually that common in agencies, which surprises a lot of people. The one that's a little bit more difficult to solve for is an earning efficiency problem. So either they're not charging enough, and or they're charging enough, but they're not efficient at getting the work done. They're constantly spending too much time on things. That can take a while to fix, especially when the work is project-based and those projects take place over a long time horizons, right? So if you're selling 2-year software development projects, and your sales cycle is 7-8 months long to close those deals, well, we could identify today, John, that like, hey, you've got a pricing problem, but it's probably going to take 2 years for you to like fully see that, change the life cycle and the profitability of the business, unless you have some way to accelerate the turnover of those projects, or you have some way to renegotiate the existing contracts that you have. And in some cases, that's an opportunity. In other cases, it's not. So the nature of the problem and the nature of the work are going to determine really like how long it takes to see a big change to the bottom line.
Slightly different track here for this question, but it's just something I'm very curious about, since you get to work with so many different types of agencies. Obviously, some agencies are laser focused towards kind of one particular type of service they want to be really good at. Other agencies are full service, solve a lot of different problems for their clients. What would you say are some of the maybe unique challenges or opportunities that you see for the more laser focused type of agency versus the more full service type of agency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a bit of a different opinion on this than I think most of the thought leaders in the space. Like, I think the messaging from the thought leadership sphere historically has been, you got to niche down, right? It's like, it's always better to be a specialized agency. It's always better to focus on fewer things. It's always better to be niche. And, you know, I'm not here to say that there aren't advantages to doing those things. And I haven't seen firms be highly profitable, you know, improve their go-to-market, get better at closing clients, get more efficient, charge higher rates. Like, all of those are and can be byproducts of specializing, but they're not inherent. And I think what people miss in the conversation about specialization is that it's not about the tactical or the vertical and horizontal sort of elements of specialization. In that, you know, if you tell me we are a Facebook agency for home builders, well, that's not inherently good positioning. It's only inherently good positioning if upstream from that you have a problem, which is home builders struggle with generating leads on Meta. Therefore, we run Facebook ads for home builders, right? In the same way that being a full service agency is not inherently problematic if the problem that you solve actually necessitates that as the best possible solution to that problem. And so I think people focus too much on sort of the structural elements of the agency when they think about positioning and expertise, and not enough on what I believe is actually the foundation of that, which is the problem in the market that is both underserved and high value enough to solve, that it allows you to position yourself in a small category, develop expertise, and ideally charge rates that are outsized relative to the market, so that either you can have higher margins or you can run a business that's more forgiving from an operational perspective, because you don't have to be perfect at operations to still make a profit, which I think for a lot of creative types that frankly, like, that is not their skill set. I don't know a lot of agency owners that like operations is, they would tell you operations is my skill set. Like, that's really what I was born to do. Not a lot of people are going to tell you that. So it behooves them to put themselves in a position where they can still win without that being a very strong muscle on the founding team. So that's sort of at a high level how I think about that. We could dig into maybe some of the structural elements that we have seen generate more profits, because we have seen some patterns there.
I'd love to dig into that and hear what are the patterns that the overachievers or the top 1% are seeing, that you're seeing?
Yeah. So I do have an answer for this, and it's supported by empirical data, like just what we've seen auditing agencies. But here's the thing that might surprise people, right? Is of course with every industry, and it's the same in our client base, there's a bell curve, right? There's a sort of a standard distribution of, you have some firms on one end that have been like wildly unprofitable to the extent that they were like losing hundreds of thousands of dollars when we started working with them. That happens. And on the other side of that, you have firms that are wildly profitable to the extent that they're making like 50-60% net operating margins, which sounds like I'm making a mistake and I'm saying something wrong, but it's not. Like, now there's not a lot of them, but they exist. And then the vast majority in the middle are sitting somewhere between break even and let's call it 20-30% EBITDA. That's sort of the middle distribution of that curve. And when we look at the agencies that are sort of on the upper end of that curve, you would think like, oh, they're selling to a specific industry, they have a certain structure, they have a certain expertise positioning. But what's interesting is we've seen two types of firms there that are complete opposites from each other. Some are really like actually highly competitive markets, not very specialized, not high priced, but they're really, really good operators, and they've really figured out how to dial in a business model. In some cases, they've even been white label agencies, and they're doing extremely well. Yeah. And in other cases, it's been sort of the opposite of that, the highly niched, highly expert, strategic, high-priced firms. But here's what the common thread was between them. And I think that this is my thesis on where our industry is headed. We spent the last decade talking incessantly about specialization. Right, in positioning, and really we've been talking about it from an external perspective, like who do you sell to? That's the sort of the perspective of specialization. What is your specialization to the outside world? Where I have noticed firms are extremely profitable, and where I think the industry is headed is when they also start to specialize internally, right? So the stuff that nobody can see, they ask themselves, as a business operating team, as a founding team, as a leadership team, what are our strengths? What are we good at? Let's build those functions internally. What are we not good at? Let's outsource those business functions. Right? So for example, if nobody on your team had an accounting background, you would probably hire an accounting firm to do your finances. Right. Well, if we extend that idea to everything, including service delivery, you end up with firms like, for example, the SEO firm that we worked with that was incredibly profitable, that was highly specialized, sold to a specific niche, very well known. But they really, from a service delivery perspective, the roles they hired internally for were strategy, sales, account management. And then everything else, link building, content, technical SEO, website design development, they partnered with other white label firms to do that work because it wasn't their skill set.
Right.
And they scaled incredibly fast to multiple 8 figures and were wildly profitable doing that. In the same way that the white label firms that we worked with that were highly profitable recognized that like they were great business operators. They knew how to do that business well, but they were not very good at client relationship management, sales, business development, strategy, right? But if they could be downstream from other brands that were doing that well, they could really own the operations piece because that was what was natural to them. They knew how to build teams in these, offshore markets and find, low-cost talent and build great culture and retain them, right? Things that are very hard to do if you don't know how to do them. Yeah. So that has been the common thread. It's actually not, I think, what everybody was expecting me to say and maybe hoping for me to say, which is like sell this service to this niche and structure your business this way and you'll make money. It's actually not that black and white. Sure. The true skill set here, it's a little more nuanced, is knowing your strengths and designing your business in alignment with those strengths as a management team.
Yeah, thanks for walking through that. And I like what you're saying in terms of, a lot of the focus has been on specialization, external specialization so much, but really framing it around what is the problem the client has. Because there are a lot of clients, and we work with a lot of clients who their problem is, they have limited time and resources. They don't want to have 5 or 6 different specialized people doing different things, that they have, different vendors they have to go talk with. They want someone who knows their problems, knows their business, and they can have, one point of contact and things get done in the background. But on the flip side, like you said, there's also those businesses who do want those specializations. So I think it's a good way to think about it. I also am really curious to get your take on where we're at right now as an industry with the buzzword AI, obviously. No podcast can get away these days without saying AI. Yeah. But I see really two massive aspects right now where AI is impacting agencies. One is just on how people actually find information on the consumer side of things. Obviously, people starting to go to ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever instead of doing a Google search for something, and how they find information is changing. And then obviously on the execution side of things, there are AI tools, abilities to try and get things done more quickly, better, more faster from an efficiency standpoint. So I'd love to hear, take this wherever you want to go. But what are your thoughts? How are you seeing AI impact agencies and any of those areas? And where do you think we're headed?
What is AI? I'm just kidding.
First question.
I'm just joking. Could you imagine?
Well, I mean,
AI. This is the first time hearing about this. Tell me more.
It's a joke, but it's also. I mean, I'm glad that you asked that in a joking way, just because it is such a buzzword too these days, where you say AI, and businesses are like, oh, okay, well, it's this black box. Things will magically work because you say, oh, our software is AI oriented or whatever. So yeah. It's said as a joke, but it also is actually a real question sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure that it's like, I'm sure it's the same way that marketers feel when people are like, hey, you do marketing, or, can you teach me about marketing? And it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, marketing is such a big thing. And I think the same thing is true about AI. It's like you could have a lot of people saying that they're an AI company, and it's like there's a big difference between using ChatGPT as part of your SOP versus doing API calls to ChatGPT versus building novel large language learning models versus doing other stuff, robotics, machine learning, machine vision, all those kinds of things, all of which have value. But anyway, I digress. So the first elephant in the room is obviously like the disruption of search. And what's interesting to me about this is just SEO. Like, SEO has always been a game of cat and mouse between some black box algorithm. It just happens that it was like mostly happening on Google for the last decade, and the SEO firms. And it's this constant game of Google tries to stay a step ahead and, like make it harder to game the system, and everybody else is trying to reverse engineer that all the time. The same thing is going to happen with AI, right? There's going to be ways to figure out how to game that system and show up in results and build authority. And the SEO industry has always been incredibly good at playing that game. And so to me, it's just more of the same. There's just this very disruptive platform shift. And inevitably, there are some firms that maybe are just like, they don't have the energy, or they don't have the expertise, or they're just like, for whatever reason, they're just not, they don't have it in them to make this next platform shift. But like, this doesn't seem different at all to me than what SEO has always been. It's just, different context, different technology, a little bit more uncertainty, but the game is still the same. And the good news is, like, at least what we've observed from our own SEO practice internally, is the fundamentals of SEO are still the backbone of ranking for AI. It's topical authority. If anything, it's just like placing more emphasis on topical authority. And, we've been seeing that work well for us at Parakeeto, where we're showing up in a lot of AI searches because we have such great topical authority around the specific things that, you and I talk about. It is so funny when I do I did deep research yesterday on a topic, and like a bunch of our own articles were linked as sources in that. And I was like, that's awesome. So yeah, that'll be interesting from like a platform shift in the market, for like the search industry as a whole, and the agencies are in that space. But again, like, I have a mad amount of respect for everybody that is in the SEO space, because like, it is unrelenting. It's the same thing about paid advertising as well, which is also ripe for some disruption. But that industry has always rewarded people that are able to constantly adapt, because it's what's necessary to stay relevant in that industry. Yeah. So then moving forward to like broader execution, certainly there is a big shift coming here. And, anybody that's been playing around with image generation tools, that's been playing around with website development tools, UX, UI design, vibe coding. I mean, I built a pricing calculator that we deployed on our website recently using V0. And I've never written a line of code in my life. Like, the closest thing to writing code that I've ever done was writing Excel formulas. And I was able to build and deploy production technology in an afternoon as a completely non-technical person. That is insane. Like, that is absolutely insane. That should not be possible, but it is. Yeah. And so that stuff, it really brings into question, like, if you're in an agency and you're in the business of selling deliverables, low skill labor, commoditized, like, there's a lot of things that people pay agencies to do today that probably won't be a thing anymore. Or if you are paying someone else to do them, the price, like, pressure on that is going to become so intense that it's not to say that you can't win and there'll be a ton of volume. Like, this is the thing that's always been true about humans, is if you look at like every major productivity multiplier that we've had in human history, the Industrial Revolution, agriculture, the internet, right? There's always this fear, and we have the same narrative going on in the industry right now, which is that it's somehow like a zero-sum game, and whatever amount of things we're consuming or using right now is static. But the other side of that is, well, what if we can do 10 times more at the same cost, therefore we consume 10 times more? Yeah. And so, there's another perspective on this, and human history has shown that we tend to, when given the choice of doing the same amount in less time or doing more with the same amount of time, we tend to do more. That's human nature. Yeah. So if you look at like graphic design, website design, development, content, like a lot of these services that are going to get fairly commoditized, that's probably the direction that is going to go. Is, yes, the price point will come down. Yes, the efficiency will go up. Yes, the competition on efficiency will go up. And if you want to compete there, you're going to have to be a friggin' good operator. However, the volume is probably also going to be orders of magnitude higher, because it'll become more accessible to more people, right? So in the sense that, like, today, you need to spend several $100s for a decent quality blog post. Well, when that same blog post only costs $10 to be written and edited and published and all of that stuff, well, a lot more businesses are going to be able to do that, and they'll be able to publish a lot more content than before. That might be a bad example, because like, who knows if blogs are even going to exist in 2 years, but you get the idea. Right. Graphic design, decks, updates to the website, whatever. Yep. So, that's one idea. And so how does that actually reflect in terms of execution for firms? Well, I think that I talked about internal specialization earlier. This to me reinforces that thesis, because what I'm seeing is the sea is parting, and the middle ground between being a deliverables efficiency sort of like factory for outputs kind of shop where you're being hired to like produce a thing, and highly strategic firms that people hire because they have expertise at solving problems and they understand that problem deeply, that the middle is parting. And I think as a firm, you really you have to start to decide which of these are we going to be and what is true to our skill set. And I don't think that there's a wrong answer. I'm not here to tell you that like you have to be the expertise-based firm. I think a lot of people will tell you that, but I don't think it's true. But I do think you have to decide, because trying to be both is going to be increasingly difficult, and being in the middle, I think, is just going to be increasingly not viable. And so that's, you know, how I see it, is like either you're going to get hyper efficient and that's going to be the reason that you really have to embrace AI, or if you become an expertise-based firm, you'll be able to still create like some kind of defensible, differentiated value because of the secret sauce that you're able to wrap AI in. So I think about like, I mean, everybody has this experience. You ask an LLM a question, and it just tells you what everybody else thinks about that.
Right.
And in some cases, it just tells you things that are flat out wrong, and it hallucinates, right? And so if you actually know the answers because you are on the bleeding edge of a problem, then that's not a problem that AI is just going to democratize right away. Like the thing that AI is not good at, can't really do well, is come up with things that humans haven't already thought about. Now that might really change. You know, recently Elon talked about what he's doing with Grok 4 and how they're going to start training on synthetic data that's generated by AI models. And that might be a paradigm shift. It's, you know, TBD on how that's going to play out. But today, like, if you are truly on the bleeding edge of a problem space, you have genuine expertise, you really understand the nuances, you can document and structure that knowledge and then use AI to accelerate or leverage, you know, your ability to deliver value on top of that framework. I think that remains defensible. And if anything, you end up with superpowers, and the spoils of being an expert will actually increase in the short term because your efficiency is going to go through the roof. And that's true because the demand is probably going to stay the same for that. The supply will likely stay the same for that because the barrier to developing expertise is still very high, right? So it's not that because this, you know, overnight, this takes 10 times less time, that means that overnight 10 times more people will enter the market, right? Because they don't have the same expertise that you have, right? So that is the defensible thing. So I do think that that's very compelling, and it's certainly exciting for our business because I think we're in that position. And that's going to become the whole thing, is like, how do you increasingly package, document, and leverage that expertise, stay on the bleeding edge, and really embrace AI as a way to help you get even closer to the edge of what's possible in that problem space and find radically better, radically more efficient ways to deliver value in that space. And in the short term, you know, that's what I think is important for agencies to be considering. But staying in the middle and not really committing to one side, I think, is going to get harder and harder and harder as the race to the bottom on sort of the more purely delivery output type firms heats up, and the pricing pressure becomes unbearable.
Wise words. No, I think one of the things that resonates with me there, what you mentioned about being on the bleeding edge, we're seeing this right now with our own agency, where we do a lot of work related to like Google Ads compliance. So helping people fix suspensions, policy issues they've come into. And, you know, a lot of people are going to LLMs to ask questions about that. They get suspended. Okay, well, wait, what happened? And similar to what you mentioned, you know, often when we do research in there as well, we see our content coming up because we put a lot of content out there. But it's so nuanced, and there's so much constantly changing with how, you know, Google enforces things and what triggers issues, that there's still generally this need of, yeah, I've got what everybody's saying about what causes suspensions, but I got to figure out the nuance. Like this is not the last step that's going to actually fix my problem. And then they end up coming to us and we help them fix that problem. And so, yeah, again, that resonates a lot with what I'm actually seeing happen in the day-to-day in our agency right now.
Yeah. There's one more space that I think is worth talking about. And this is a little bit selfish, but it's like around data. Yeah. And I think that there's this fallacy that people have that like AI is going to completely like implode any industry that's built on top of data. So accounting, you know, what we do, business intelligence, business analytics. But I know that that's not true, at least not in the short term. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I don't know if you've ever tried to just like take your P&L out of QuickBooks and give it to ChatGPT and be like, tell me about this. Yeah. And it's like, hey, the first 3 rows of, this spreadsheet are kind of weird. And so like, it just like completely shits the bed. Right. So yep. The thing that I know to be true, because we work with a lot of tech services companies, is there has never been this much spending on data infrastructure at the enterprise level, because data hygiene is a precursor to leveraging AI for data. The other thing that's really interesting is machine learning is coming back in style, because AI is actually not very good at data at all. It's not a deterministic technology. It's a probabilistic technology. And machine learning is far better for deterministic things, which is how, data typically works. So I say that because there might be a lot of people listening that like a lot of their business is actually analytics, business intelligence. Maybe they're getting into finance. Maybe they're getting into FP&A. Maybe they're getting into, this kind of insight. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to create leverage in that space. But the pain of, data needing to be clean, well structured, and there needing to be nuanced thinking and strategy and deep understanding behind like why it's structured that way, how it's structured that way, how it's leading to good outcomes, like that is still a problem that's going to persist. And I don't think that AI is just like magically mean that we don't need bookkeepers anymore, or we don't need accountants anymore, or we don't need structured data anymore, or data pipelines anymore. Like that stuff is all still, I think, very unsolved for the foreseeable future.
I agree with that. Yeah, you made me think of a couple of days ago, a client came to us. They kind of took a bunch of data, took a report, put it in ChatGPT, and sent us the output. Like, hey, let's take action on this. And then we start looking at it. It's like, well, let's not yet, because this thing's completely wrong. It completely, it's saying this one thing over here. It's absolutely the opposite of this. Doesn't have the context about why this is this way. And you have to bring the context and the nuance into that. And like you said, have correct data structure in place to begin with, or else it's just going to go very confidently hallucinate and tell you something that is right, but it's not actually right.
And in a way that's not at all observable, not at all inspectable, right? But like I think what we could both agree on is if you feed it really good data with really good context and really good rails, then it could be a transformative experience for exploring that data. 100%. I think there's a world where, for example, like the way that we currently think about running reports of like clicking through a UI and applying filters and sorting and grouping, it's like that's going to feel arcane in a couple of years, because the experience of interacting with data will be much more fluid, but the underlying requirement of it being well structured, I think, is more important now than ever. And I think that is evidenced by the massive amount of investment that's going into paying down the data ops debt that enterprises have been building for years, that finally now they're like, oh shit, we can't actually like do any of the things we want to do with AI until we fix this.
100%. Well, Marcel, I really appreciate your time today. Covered a lot of good ground here. I learned a lot myself, and I know that those watching and listening will have learned as well. As we wrap up, what is the best way for people to learn more about you and to reach out if they want to explore getting your help with their own agency?
Yeah, thank you, John. I had a really good time chatting with you today, and I hope it was helpful to everyone that's listening. If you want to connect with me, please reach out on LinkedIn. That's like where I'm most active. I'm constantly posting what I hope is helpful information on LinkedIn, and I'm very active in my DMs as well, so be sure to reach out. If you want to listen to more helpful content on how to improve the profitability of your firm, you can head to parakeeto.com, where we have a podcast called the Agency Profit Podcast, a bunch of blogs, a bunch of calculators, free resources. And if you want to go deeper and learn the essentials on how to measure and improve your profitability, you can check out the Agency Profit Toolkit. It's at no cost on our website, and it's full of training videos, cheat sheets, and other resources to help you at no cost start to get a handle on your profitability and figure out what to do next.
Fantastic. We'll get the links to all those in the show notes and description here. And so Marcel, thanks so much for your time. And for those who are watching and listening, thank you for your time. As I usually end this podcast, go forth, do well, and let's make each day a little bit better than the last.